All right, so let's do the second half of these principles of figure design. Most of these should be mostly familiar to you as we've been talking about these best practices and tidbits throughout the quarter, but a few extra considerations here that hopefully will make your project sparkle and shine. All right, here we go. So on the topic of titles, captions, and tables, so our figure table titles, the main purpose of the titles is to accurately convey to the reader what the figure is about and the point it makes. This book earlier had told us that we should be giving the so what in the title itself. This is especially useful for figures as opposed to tables because figured titles tend to also have the big long captions. It might only have the caption and have this like long explanatory thing versus tables tend to have just the titles at the top of it because they're tables are meant to go with blocks of text and figures can stand alone a little bit more. So we need to make sure that we have our jargon explained and all kind of good stuff within the figure title, caption part, and if we do have the top title, that it is comprehensive enough to convey the understanding. Paired with those are those axis titles or labels. Make sure that you're including measurements. So whether that's number of people, whether it's thousands of dollars, or it's a physical measurement like inches and grams, specify it there. You can do the like mm for millimeter, you can do shorthands, that's fine. Some things can be omitted, like you don't need to put years if you've got like 2015, 2016, 2017, if it's super obvious. But make sure that if you're omitting anything, that it is something that is super duper obvious to readers. And try to think about it in a multicultural lens. Like, don't assume that the reader has your own background when you think of what is obvious. Okay, you can assume English speaking, but try to think with that international lens so that you can capture the most audience. Okay, the next part is balancing the data and the context. So this is mostly about removing the clutter, aka the non-data ink, within reason. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about the idea of proportional ink. So this is going along with that of making sure that we're not using extra labels. So you can see throughout these, I've done this just right in the center, got too little and too much on the left and right respectively. And so you can see examples of when we've got too little ink in there, so they don't have the axis lines in there. There's nothing giving us guidance for where those dots are, and so it's hard for our eyes to kind of track where they're supposed to be, like to actually interpret the graphs. The one on the right is too much. We've got too many lines everywhere. It makes it actually hard to read the data itself. So that one in the middle is our nice balanced one. And again, the more you look at different graphs, the more you just kind of get a sense of like, oh, that's too much, and you can kind of pare it down using just sensibilities like that. Specifically for correlation graphs, they suggest using basically just the regression line and the axes labels. This is what's just standard in APA or other write-ups, pretty close, not precisely, but pretty close. And what you'll normally see on the left side without that regression line is like the big too little on that. And on the right side, you've got a really fat regression line and all those lines and stuff like that. And it's just, again, gets very busy. You can read it, it's just very busy. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Always remember to make sure that you've got axes left and right on those. Those are super, super important. They've got examples for line graphs, going back to our time type ones. And for this one, unlike this one, I included specifically because it's kind of interesting that in the correlation one, here, the regression line is our one line that helps us kind of navigate this, but otherwise there's no of that grid stuff in the background. Whereas in here, without any grid or anything, he's saying that it's too little. On the right side, this is actually a standard printout for something like R. It's too much. All the grain stuff actually makes it a little harder to read. Here, they had two examples of what works. One had several lines going across, and this one is just a single reference line. I'm assuming that the 100 is an important line. I don't know. When looking at a graph like this, I would assume that, oh, they're marking 100 because it's important for some reason. And it might just be important because it's the starting place at 2012. But yeah, so they say that at least one reference line is good enough. So again, a lot of this is probably personal taste from the author, but not a bad guidance to go off of as you develop your own sensibilities about what is too much, what is too little, and what is just right. Okay, the next section talked about using larger axis labels. My interpretation of this is be nice to us old folks. It's hard to read sometimes when things are all super duper tiny. And especially pay attention to scaling if you expect people to see it in different ways. Examples of that, I don't remember whose presentation it was, but someone had one that was on like weather apps and stuff. And so there's an example where like the same thing could be seen like on an app versus a website. And if you think your visualization is going to be seen through different modalities like that, or like, are they going to pull up your PowerPoint on their cell phones? Make sure that stuff is designed to scale appropriately, including all the legends and the axes. Yeah, so you can see like PowerPoint's actually a great way to test this out. The scaling, because you can see like this is just like obnoxiously small, no one can read that. This is fine. This is a little too big for the data. So that's what it is, the proportionality between the data and the size of the font there. Yeah. So again, personal tastes on what looks right. Tableau will give you good basic stuff to go off of. I won't worry about it too much in Tableau itself, but this is more important if you're going into other programs. Okay, number 25 is to avoid line drawings. So back in the day, before we had easy access to color for our stuff, because it used to be very expensive to print in color, and so they do everything black and white. You get a lot of line graphs like this. If you had like multiple, like a clustered thing, they'd use like the little, like the lines or the polka dots and stuff like that. They're really obnoxious. Like they're good if you don't have any other options, but they are just kind of obnoxious. And you see easily how much easier it is to read with solid lines versus these, because your eyes just kind of blend all of these together. So that applies to bar graphs and other things. In the chapter they showed pictures of like scatter plots and stuff like that with the same thing. Colors and solid shapes is better than like the skinny little like X's and stuff like that when you can. And then the last part is about 3D. I think everyone knows this by now, but if something doesn't need to be 3D, don't do it. So here you can see how a pie chart distorts so much when you do different angles and such with the 3D, and how bad that can be. That same effect happens in bar charts and everything else. It just distorts the data, and so it's really ugly, and could be misleading. Some data is actually supposed to be 3D. So these ones on the left, that is legitimate, but I've always had a really hard time dealing with these kind of graphs. And you can see that the same data with different angles on here can get really distorted. And so the author suggests putting it into a two-dimensional model by adding a third dimension, such as size, to the mix. We've been playing around with that idea, but you might not have thought about it as adding a third dimension to your data like this. So if you do come across this type of data, consider doing stuff like this. You can split things into multiple charts, other ways of handling this depending on what kind of data you have. Okay, so that wraps up our fundamentals section. So if any of these apply to stuff in your project, just, do those little tweaks and try to make it a little more pleasant to digest.